Learn English through stories E42 PDF. Adapted and modified by Kulwant Singh Sandhu. Contents: 1. Panthers moon. 2. Grammar page. 1. Panthers moon. In the entire village, he was the first to get up. Even the dog, a big hill mastiff called Shiru, was asleep in a corner of the dark room, curled up near the cold embers of the previous night's fire. Bisnu's tousled head emerged from his blanket. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and sat up on his haunches. Then, gathering his wits, he crawled in the direction of the loud ticking that came from the battered little clock, which occupied the second most honored place in a niche in the wall. The most honored place belonged to a picture of Ganesha, the god of learning, who had an elephant's head and a fat boy's body. Bringing his face close to the clock, Bisu could just make out the hands. It was 5 o'clock. He had half an hour in which to get ready and leave. He got up, in vest and underpants, and moved quietly towards the door. The soft tread of his bare feet woke Shiru, and the big black dog rose silently and padded behind the boy. The door opened and closed, and then the boy and the dog were outside in the early dawn. The month was June, and the nights were warm, even in the Himalayan valleys, but there was fresh dew on the grass. Bisu felt the dew beneath his feet. He took a deep breath and began walking down to the stream. The sound of the stream filled the small valley. At that early hour of the morning it was the only sound, but Bisu was hardly conscious of it. It was a sound he lived with and took for granted. It was only when he had crossed the hill on his way to the town, and the sound of the stream grew distant, that he really began to notice it. And it was only when the stream was too far away to be heard that he really missed its sound. He slipped out of his underclothes, gazed for a few moments at the goose pimples rising on his flesh, and then dashed into the shallow stream. As he went further in, the cold mountain water reached his loins and navel, and he gasped with shock and pleasure. He drifted slowly with the current, swam across to a small inlet which formed a fairly deep pool, and plunged into the water. Shiru hated cold water at this early hour. Had the sun been up, he would not have hesitated to join Bisu. Now he contented himself with sitting on a smooth rock and gazing placidly at the slim brown boy splashing about in the clear water in the widening light of dawn. Bisu did not stay long in the water. There wasn't time. When he returned to the house, he found his mother up, making tea and chapatis. His sister, Pooja, was still asleep. She was a little older than Bisnu, a pretty girl with large black eyes, good teeth and strong arms and legs. During the day, she helped her mother in the house and in the fields. She did not go to the school with Bisu. But when he came home in the evenings, he would try teaching her some of the things he had learned. Their father was dead. Bisnu, at 12, considered himself the head of the family. He ate 2 chapatis after spreading butter oil on them. He drank a glass of hot sweet tea. His mother gave 2 thick chapatis to Shiru, and the dog wolfed them down in a few minutes. Then she wrapped 2 chapatis and some gourd curry in some big green leaves and handed these to Bisnu. This was his lunch packet. His mother and Pooja would take their meal afterwards. When Bisnu was dressed, he stood with folded hands before the picture of Ganesha. Ganesha is the god who blesses all beginnings. The author who begins to write a new book, the banker who opens a new ledger, the traveler who starts on a journey, all invoke the kindly help of Ganesha. And as Bisnu made a journey every day, he never left without the goodwill of the elephant-headed god. How, one might ask, did Ganesha get his elephant's head? When born, he was a beautiful child. Parvati, his mother, was so proud of him that she went about showing him to everyone. Unfortunately, she made the mistake of showing the child to that envious planet, Saturn, who promptly burnt off poor Ganesha's head. Parvati, in despair, went to Brahma, the creator, for a new head for her son. He had no head to give her, but advised her to search for some man or animal caught in a sinful or wrong act. Parvati wandered about until she came upon an elephant sleeping with its head the wrong way, that is, to the south. She promptly removed the elephant's head and planted it on Ganesha's shoulders, where it took root. Bisu knew this story. He had heard it from his mother. Wearing a white shirt and black shorts and a pair of worn white kids, he was ready for his long walk to school, 5 miles up the mountain. His sister woke up just as he was about to leave. She pushed the hair away from her face and gave Bisnu one of her rare smiles. "I hope you have not forgotten," she said. "Forgotten?" said Bisnu, pretending innocence. "Is there anything I am supposed to remember?" "Don't tease me. You promised to buy me a pair of bangles, remember? I hope you won't spend the money on sweets as you did last time." "Oh yes, your bangles," said Bisu. "Girls have nothing better to do than waste money on trinkets. Now, don't lose your temper. I'll get them for you. Red and gold are the colors you want." "Yes, Baya," said Pooja gently, pleased that Bisnu had remembered the colors. "And for your dinner tonight, we'll make you something special, won't we, Mother?" "Yes, but hurry up and get dressed. There is some plowing to be done today. The rains will soon be here, if the gods are kind." "The monsoon will be late this year," said Bisu. "Mr. Nadial, our teacher, told us so. He said it had nothing to do with the gods." "Be off, you are getting late," said Pooja, before Bisnu could begin an argument with his mother. She was diligently winding the old clock. It was quite light in the room. The sun would be up any minute. Bisnu shouldered his school bag, kissed his mother, pinched his sister's cheeks, and left the house. He started climbing the steep path up the mountainside. Shiru bounded ahead, for he, too, always went with Bisnu to school. 5 miles to school. Every day, except Sunday, Bisu walked 5 miles to school, and in the evening he walked home again. There was no school in his own small village of Manjari, for the village consisted of only 5 families. The nearest school was at Kempty, a small township on the bus route through the district of Garhwal. A number of boys walked to school, from distances of 2 or 3 miles. Their villages were not quite as remote as Manjari. But Bisnu's village lay right at the bottom of the mountain, a drop of over 2,000 feet from Kempty. There was no proper road between the village and the town. In Kempty there was a school, a small mission hospital, a post office, and several shops. In Manjari village there were none of these amenities. If you were sick, you stayed at home until you got well. If you were very sick, you walked or were carried to the hospital, up the 5-mile path. If you wanted to buy something, you went without it, but if you wanted it very badly, you could walk the 5 miles to Kempty. Manjari was known as the 5-mile village. Twice a week, if there were any letters, a postman came to the village. Bisu usually passed the postman on his way to and from school. There were other boys in Manjari village, but Bisu was the only one who went to school. His mother would not have fussed if he had stayed at home and worked in the fields. That was what the other boys did, all except lazy Chitru, who preferred fishing in the stream or helping himself to the fruit off other people's trees. But Bisu went to school. He went because he wanted to. No one could force him to go, and no one could stop him from going. He had set his heart on receiving a good schooling. He wanted to read and write as well as anyone in the big world, the world that seemed to begin only where the mountains ended. He felt cut off from the world in his small valley. He would rather live at the top of a mountain than at the bottom of one. That was why he liked climbing to Kempty. It took him to the top of the mountain, and from its ridge he could look down on his own valley to the north, and on the wide, endless plains stretching towards the south. The plainsman looks to the hills for the needs of his spirit, but the hillman looks to the plains for a living. Leaving the village and the fields below him, Bisnu climbed steadily up the bare hillside, now dry and brown. By the time the sun was up, he had entered the welcome shade of an oak and rhododendron forest. Shiru went bounding ahead, chasing squirrels and barking at langurs. A colony of langurs lived in the oak forest. They fed on oak leaves, acorns, and other green things, and usually remained in the trees, coming down to the ground only to play or bask in the sun. They were beautiful, supple-limbed animals, with black faces and silver-gray coats and long, sensitive tails. They leapt from tree to tree with great agility. The young ones wrestled on the grass like boys. A dignified community, the langurs did not have the cheekiness or dishonest habits of the red monkeys of the plains. They did not approach dogs or humans. But they had grown used to Bisnu's comings and goings, and did not fear him. Some of the older ones would watch him quietly, a little puzzled. They did not go near the town, because the Kempty boys threw stones at them. And anyway, the oak forest gave them all the food they required. Emerging from the trees, Bisu crossed a small brook. Here, he stopped to drink the fresh, clean water of a spring. The brook tumbled down the mountain and joined the river a little below Bisnu's village. Coming from another direction was a second path, and at the junction of the two paths, Saru was waiting for him. Saru came from a small village about 3 miles from Bisnu's and closer to the town. He had 2 large milk cans slung over his shoulders. Every morning he carried this milk to town, selling 1 can to the school and the other to Dr. Taylor, the lady doctor at the small mission hospital. He was a little older than Bisu, but not as well built. They hailed each other, and Saru fell into step beside Bisu. They often met at this spot, keeping each other company for the remaining 2 miles to Kempty. "There was a panther in our village last night," said Saru. This information interested, but did not excite Bisu. Panthers were common enough in the hills and did not usually present a problem, except during the winter months, when their natural prey was scarce. Then, occasionally, a panther would take to haunting the outskirts of a village, seizing a careless dog or a stray goat. "Did you lose any animals?" asked Bisu. "No. It tried to get into the cowshed, but the dogs set up an alarm. We drove it off. It must be the same one which came around last winter. We lost a calf and 2 dogs in our village." "Wasn't that the one the shikars wounded? I hope it hasn't become a cattle lifter." "It could be the same. It has a bullet in its leg. These hunters are the people who cause all the trouble. They think it's easy to shoot a panther. It would be better if they missed altogether, but they usually wound it. And then the panther's too slow to catch the barking deer and starts on our own animals. We're lucky it didn't become a man-eater. Do you remember the man-eater 6 years ago? I was very small then. My father told me all about it. 10 people were killed in our valley alone. What happened to it? I don't know. Some say it poisoned itself when it ate the headman of another village." Bisnu laughed. "No one like that old villain. He must have been a man-eater himself in some previous existence." They linked arms and scrambled up the stony path. Shiru began barking and ran ahead. Someone was coming down the path. It was Melaram, the postman. "Any letters for us?" asked Bisnu and Saru together. They never received any letters, but that did not stop them from asking. It was one way of finding out who had received letters. "You're welcome to all of them," said Melaram. "If you'll carry my bag for me." "Not today," said Saru. "We're busy today. Is there a letter from Corporal Ganshiam for his family?" "Yes, there's a postcard for his people. He is posted on the Ladakh border now and finds it very cold there." Postcards, unlike sealed letters, were considered public property and were read by everyone. The senders knew that too, and so Corporal Ganshiam Singh was careful to mention that he expected a promotion very soon. He wanted everyone in his village to know it. Melaram, complaining of sore feet, continued on his way, and the boys carried on up the path. It was 8 o'clock when they reached Kempty. Dr. Taylor's outpatients were just beginning to trickle in at the hospital gate. The doctor was trying to prop up a rose creeper, which had blown down during the night. She liked attending to her plants in the mornings before starting on her patients. She found this helped her in her work. There was a lot in common between ailing plants and ailing people. Dr. Taylor was 50, white-haired but fresh in the face and full of vitality. She had been in India for 20 years, and 10 of these had been spent working in the hill regions. She saw Bisnu coming down the road. She knew about the boy and his long walk to school and admired him for his keenness and sense of purpose. She wished there were more like him. Bisnu greeted her shyly. Shiru barked and put his paws up on the gate. "Yes, there's a bone for you," said Dr. Taylor. She often put aside bones for the big black dog, for she knew that Bisnu's people could not afford to give the dog a regular diet of meat, though he did well enough on milk and chapatis. She threw the bone over the gate, and Shiru caught it before it fell. The school bell began ringing, and Bisnu broke into a run. Shiru loped along behind the boy. When Bisnu entered the school gate, Shiru sat down on the grass of the compound. He would remain there until the lunch break. He knew of various ways of amusing himself during school hours and had friends among the bazaar dogs. But just then he didn't want company. He had his bone to get on with. Mr. Nadial, Bisnu's teacher, was in a bad mood. He was a keen rose grower, and only that morning, on getting up and looking out of his bedroom window, he had been horrified to see a herd of goats in his garden. He had chased them down the road with a stick, but the damage had already been done. His prize roses had all been consumed. Mr. Nadial had been so upset that he had gone without his breakfast. He had also cut himself whilst shaving. Thus, his mood had gone from bad to worse. Several times during the day, he brought down his ruler on the knuckles of any boy who irritated him. Bisnu was one of his best pupils. But even Bisnu irritated him by asking too many questions about a new sum which Mr. Nadial didn't feel like explaining. That was the kind of day it was for Mr. Nadial. Most school teachers know similar days. Poor Mr. Nadial, thought Besser. I wonder why he's so upset. It must be because of his pay. He doesn't get much money, but he's a good teacher. I hope he doesn't take another job. But after Mr. Nadial had eaten his lunch, his mood improved, as it always did after a meal, and the rest of the day passed serenely. Armed with a bundle of homework, Bisnu came out from the school compound at 4 o'clock, and was immediately joined by Shiru. He proceeded down the road in the company of several of his classfellows. But he did not linger long in the bazaar. There were 5 miles to walk, and he did not like to get home too late. Usually he reached his house just as it was beginning to get dark. Saru had gone home long ago, and Bisnu had to make the return journey on his own. It was a good opportunity to memorize the words of an English poem he had been asked to learn. Bisnu had reached the little brook when he remembered the bangles he had promised to buy for his sister. "Oh, I've forgotten them again," he said aloud. "Now I'll catch it, and she's probably made something special for my dinner." Shu, to whom these words were addressed, paid no attention but bounded off into the oak forest. Bisnu looked around for the monkeys, but they were nowhere to be seen. Strange, he thought. I wonder why they have disappeared. He was startled by a sudden sharp cry, followed by a fierce yelp. He knew at once that Shura was in trouble. The noise came from the bushes down the cud into which the dog had rushed but a few seconds previously. Bisnu jumped off the path and ran down the slope towards the bushes. There was no dog and not a sound. He whistled and called, but there was no response. Then he saw something lying on the dry grass. He picked it up. It was a portion of a dog's collar, stained with blood. It was Sheru's collar and Sheru's blood. Bisu did not search further. He knew, without a doubt, that Sheru had been seized by a panther. No other animal could have attacked so silently and swiftly and carried off a big dog without a struggle. Sheru was dead, must have been dead within seconds of being caught and flung into the air. Bisu knew the danger that lay in wait for him if he followed the blood trail through the trees. The panther would attack anyone who interfered with its meal. With tears starting in his eyes, Bisu carried on down the path to the village. His fingers still clutched the little bit of blood-stained collar that was all that was left of his dog. Bisu was not a very sentimental boy, but he sorrowed for his dog, who had been his companion on many a hike into the hills and forests. He did not sleep that night, but turned restlessly from side to side, moaning softly. After some time he felt Pooja's hand on his head. She began stroking his brow. He took her hand in his own, and the clasp of her rough, warm, familiar hand gave him a feeling of comfort and security. Next morning, when he went down to the stream to bathe, he missed the presence of his dog. He did not stay long in the water. It wasn't as much fun when there was no Sheru to watch him. When Bisnu's mother gave him his food, she told him to be careful and hurry home that evening. A panther, even if it is only a cowardly lifter of sheep or dogs, is not to be trifled with. And this particular panther had shown some daring by seizing the dog even before it was dark. Still, there was no question of staying away from school. If Bisnu remained at home every time a panther put in an appearance, he might just as well stop going to school altogether. He set off even earlier than usual and reached the meeting of the paths long before Saru. He did not wait for his friend because he did not feel like talking about the loss of his dog. It was not the day for the postman, and so Bisnu reached Kamptee without meeting anyone on the way. He tried creeping past the hospital gate unnoticed, but Dr. Taylor saw him, and the first thing she said was, "Where's Sheru? I've got something for him." When Dr. Taylor saw the boy's face, she knew at once that something was wrong. "What is it, Bisnu?" she asked. She looked quickly up and down the road. "Is it Sheru?" He nodded gravely. "A panther took him," he said. "In the village?" "No, while we were walking home through the forest. I did not see anything, but I heard." Dr. Taylor knew that there was nothing she could say that would console him, and she tried to conceal the bone which she had brought out for the dog, but Bisnu noticed her hiding it behind her back, and the tears welled up in his eyes. He turned away and began running down the road. His schoolfellows noticed Sheru's absence and questioned Bisnu. He had to tell them everything. They were full of sympathy, but they were also quite thrilled at what had happened and kept pestering Bisnu for all the details. There was a lot of noise in the classroom, and Mr. Naudiel had to call for order. When he learned what had happened, he patted Bisnu on the head and told him that he need not attend school for the rest of the day. But Bisnu did not want to go home. After school, he got into a fight with one of the boys, and that helped him forget. The panther that plunged the village into an atmosphere of gloom and terror may not have been the same panther that took Sheru. There was no way of knowing, and it would have made no difference, because the panther that came by night and struck at the people of Manjari was that most feared of wild creatures, a man-eater. 9-year-old Sanjay, son of Kalam Singh, was the first child to be attacked by the panther. Kalam Singh's house was the last in the village and nearest to the stream. Like the other houses, it was quite small, just a room above and a stable below, with steps leading up from outside the house. He lived there with his wife, 2 sons. Sanjay was the youngest, and little daughter Basanti, who had just turned 3. Sanjay had brought his father's cows home after grazing them on the hillside in the company of other children. He had also brought home an edible wild plant, which his mother cooked into a tasty dish for their evening meal. They had their food at dusk, sitting on the floor of their single room, and soon after, settled down for the night. Sanjay curled up in his favorite spot, with his head near the door, where he got a little fresh air. As the nights were warm, the door was usually left a little ajar. Sanjay's mother piled ash on the embers of the fire and the family was soon asleep. No one heard the stealthy padding of a panther approaching the door, pushing it wider open. But suddenly, there were sounds of a frantic struggle, and Sanjay's stifled cries were mixed with the grunts of the panther. Kalam Singh leapt to his feet with a shout. The panther had dragged Sanjay out of the door and was pulling him down the steps when Kalam Singh started battering at the animal with a large stone. The rest of the family screamed in terror, rousing the entire village. A number of men came to Kalam Singh's assistance, and the panther was driven off. But Sanjay lay unconscious. Someone brought a lantern, and the boy's mother screamed when she saw her small son with his head lying in a pool of blood. It looked as if the side of his head had been eaten off by the panther. But he was still alive, and as Kalam Singh plastered ash on the boy's head to stop the bleeding, he found that though the scalp had been torn off one side of the head, the bare bone was smooth and unbroken. "He won't live through the night," said a neighbor. "We'll have to carry him down to the river in the morning." The dead were always cremated on the banks of a small river which flowed past Manjari village. Suddenly the panther, still prowling about the village, called out in rage and frustration, and the villagers rushed to their homes in panic and barricaded themselves in for the night. Sanjay's mother sat by the boy for the rest of the night, weeping and watching. Towards dawn he started to moan and show signs of coming round. At this sign of returning consciousness, Kalam Singh rose determinedly and looked around for his stick. He told his elder son to remain with the mother and daughter, as he was going to take Sanjay to Dr. Taylor at the hospital. "See, he is moaning and in pain," said Kalam Singh. "That means he has a chance to live if he can be treated at once." With a stout stick in his hand and Sanjay on his back, Kalam Singh set off on the 2 miles of hard mountain track to the hospital at Kempty. His son, a blood-stained cloth around his head, was moaning but still hadn't regained consciousness. When at last Kalam Singh climbed up through the last fields below the hospital, he asked for the doctor and stammered out an account of what had happened. It was a terrible injury, as Dr. Taylor discovered. The bone over almost 1/3 of the head was bare, and the scalp was torn all round. As the father told his story, the doctor cleaned and dressed the wound, and then gave Sanjay a shot of penicillin to prevent sepsis. Later, Kalam Singh carried the boy home again. After this, the panther went away for some time. But the people of Manjari could not be sure of its whereabouts. They kept to their houses after dark and shut their doors. Vishnu had to stop going to school because there was no one to accompany him, and it was dangerous to go alone. This worried him because his final exam was only a few weeks off and he would be missing important classwork. When he wasn't in the fields, helping with the sowing of rice and maize, he would be sitting in the shade of a chestnut tree, going through his well-thumbed second-hand school books. He had no other reading, except for a copy of the Ramayana and a Hindi translation of Alice in Wonderland. These were well preserved, read only in fits and starts, and usually kept locked in his mother's old tin trunk. Sanjay had nightmares for several nights and woke up screaming. But with the resilience of youth, he quickly recovered. At the end of the week, he was able to walk to the hospital, though his father always accompanied him. Even a desperate panther will hesitate to attack a party of 2. Sanjay, with his thin little face and huge bandaged head, looked a pathetic figure, but he was getting better and the wound looked healthy. Vishnu often went to see him, and the 2 boys spent long hours together near the stream. Sometimes Chitru would join them, and they would try catching fish with a homemade net. They were often successful in taking home 1 or 2 mountain trout. Sometimes Vishnu and Chitru wrestled in the shallow water or on the grassy banks of the stream. Chitru was a chubby boy with a broad chest, strong legs and thighs, and when he used his weight he got Bisnu under him. But Bisnu was hard and wiry and had very strong wrists and fingers. When he had Chitru in a vice, the bigger boy would cry out and give up the struggle. Sanjay could not join in these games. He had never been a very strong boy, and he needed plenty of rest if his wounds were to heal well. The panther had not been seen for over a week, and the people of Manjari were beginning to hope that it might have moved on over the mountain or further down the valley. "I think I can start going to school again," said Bisu. "The panther has gone away." "Don't be too sure," said Pooja. "The moon is full these days, and perhaps it is only being cautious." "Wait a few days," said their mother. "It is better to wait. Perhaps you could go the day after tomorrow, when Sanjay goes to the hospital with his father. Then you will not be alone." And so 2 days later, Bisu went up to Kempty with Sanjay and Kalam Singh. Sanjay's wound had almost healed over. Little islets of flesh had grown over the bone. Dr. Taylor told him that he need come to see her only once a fortnight instead of every third day. Bisu went to his school and was given a warm welcome by his friends and by Mr. Naudio. "You'll have to work hard," said his teacher. "You have to catch up with the others. If you like, I can give you some extra time after classes." "Thank you, sir, but it will make me late," said Bisnu. "I must get home before it is dark, otherwise my mother will worry. I think the panther has gone, but nothing is sudden." "Well, you mustn't take risks. Do your best, Bisu. Work hard and you'll soon catch up with your lessons." Sanjay and Kalam Singh were waiting for him outside the school. Together they took the path down to Manjari, passing the postman on the way. Melaram said he had heard that the panther was in another district and that there was nothing to fear. He was on his rounds again. Nothing happened on the way. The langurs were back in their favorite part of the forest. Bisnu got home just as the kerosene lamp was being lit. Pooja met him at the door with a winsome smile. "Did you get the bangles?" she asked. But Bisnu had forgotten again. There had been a thunderstorm and some rain, a short, sharp shower which gave the villagers hope that the monsoon would arrive on time. It brought out the thunder lilies, a pink, crocus-like flowers which sprang up on the hillsides immediately after a summer shower. Bisu, on his way home from school, was caught in the rain. He knew the shower would not last, so he took shelter in a small cave, and to pass the time, began doing sums, scratching figures in the damp earth with the end of a stick. When the rain stopped, he came out from the cave and continued down the path. He wasn't in a hurry. The rain had made everything smell fresh and good. The scent from fallen pine needles rose from the wet earth. The leaves of the oak trees had been washed clean, and a light breeze turned them about, showing their silver undersides. The birds, refreshed and high-spirited, set up a terrific noise. The worst offenders were the yellow-bottomed bulbuls who squabbled and fought in the blackberry bushes. A barbet, high up in the branches of a deodar, set up its querulous plaintive call. And a flock of bright green parrots came swooping down the hill to settle in a wild plum tree and feast on the unripe fruit. The langurs, too, had been revived by the rain. They leapt friskily from tree to tree, greeting Bisu with little grunts. He was almost out of the oak forest when he heard a faint bleating. Presently, a little goat came stumbling up the path towards him. The kid was far from home and must have strayed from the rest of the herd. But it was not yet conscious of being lost. It came to Bisnu with a hop, skip, and a jump, and started nuzzling against his legs like a cat. "I wonder who you belong to," mused Bisu, stroking the little creature. "You'd better come home with me until someone claims you." He didn't have to take the kid in his arms. It was used to humans and followed close at his heels. Now that darkness was coming on, Bisu walked a little faster. He had not gone very far when he heard the sawing grunt of a panther. The sound came from the hill to the right, and Bisnu judged the distance to be anything from 100 to 200 yards. He hesitated on the path, wondering what to do. Then he picked the kid up in his arms and hurried on in the direction of home and safety. The panther called again, much closer now. If it was an ordinary panther, it would go away on finding that the kid was with Bisu. If it was the man-eater, it would not hesitate to attack the boy, for no man-eater fears a human. There was no time to lose, and there did not seem much point in running. Bisu looked up and down the hillside. The forest was far behind him, and there were only a few trees in his vicinity. He chose a spruce. The branches of the Himalayan spruce are very brittle and snap easily beneath a heavy weight. They were strong enough to support Bisnu's light frame. It was unlikely they would take the weight of a full-grown panther. At least that was what Bisnu hoped. Holding the kid with one arm, Bisnu gripped a low branch and swung himself up into the tree. He was a good climber. Slowly but confidently he climbed halfway up the tree until he was about 12 feet above the ground. He couldn't go any higher without risking a fall. He had barely settled himself in the crook of a branch when the panther came into the open, running into the clearing at a brisk trot. This was no stealthy approach, no wary stalking of its prey. It was the man-eater, all right. Bisu felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He felt a little sick. The panther stood in the clearing with a slight thrusting forward of the head. This gave it the appearance of gazing intently and rather short-sightedly at some invisible object in the clearing. But there is nothing short-sighted about a panther's vision. Its sight and hearing are acute. Bisu remained motionless in the tree and sent up a prayer to all the gods he could think of. But the kid began bleeding. The panther looked up and gave its deep-throated, rasping grunt, a fearsome sound calculated to strike terror in any tree-born animal. Many a monkey, petrified by a panther's roar, has fallen from its perch to make a meal for Mr. Spots. The man-eater was trying the same technique on Bisu. But though the boy was trembling with fright, he clung firmly to the base of the spruce tree. The panther did not make any attempt to leap up the tree. Perhaps it knew instinctively that this was not the type of tree that it could climb. Instead, it described a semicircle round the tree, keeping its face turned towards Bisu. Then it disappeared into the bushes. The man-eater was cunning. It hoped to put the boy off his guard, perhaps entice him down from the tree. For, a few seconds later, with a half-humorous growl, it rushed back into the clearing and then stopped, staring up at the boy in some surprise. The panther was getting frustrated. It snarled, and putting its 4 feet up against the tree trunk, began scratching at the bark in the manner of an ordinary domestic cat. The tree shook at each thud of the beast's paw. Bisnu began shouting for help. The moon had not yet come up. Down in Manjari village, Bisnu's mother and sister stood in their lighted doorway, gazing anxiously up the pathway. Every now and then, Pooja would turn to take a look at the small clock. Sanjay's father appeared in a field below. He had a kerosene lantern in his hand. "Sister, isn't your boy home as yet?" he asked. "No, he hasn't arrived. We are very worried. He should have been home an hour ago. Do you think the panther will be about tonight? There's going to be a moon." "True, but it will be dark for another hour. I will fetch the other menfolk, and we will go up the mountain for your boy. There may have been a landslide during the rain. Perhaps the path has been washed away." "Thank you, brother. But arm yourselves, just in case the panther is about." "I will take my spear," said Kalam Singh. "I have sworn to spear that devil when I find him. There is some evil spirit dwelling in the beast, and it must be destroyed." "I am coming with you," said Pooja. No, you cannot go, said her mother. It's bad enough that Bisu is in danger. You stay at home with me. This is work for men. I shall be safe with them, insisted Pooja. I'm going, mother, and she jumped down the embankment into the field and followed Sanjay's father through the village. 10 minutes later, 2 men armed with axes had joined Kalam Singh in the courtyard of his house, and the small party moved silently and swiftly up the mountain path. Pooja walked in the middle of the group, holding the lantern. As soon as the village lights were hidden by a shoulder of the hill, the men began to shout, both to frighten the panther, if it was about, and to give themselves courage. Vishnu's mother closed the front door and turned to the image of Ganesha, the god for comfort and help. Vishnu's calls were carried on the wind, and Pooja and the men heard him while they were still half a mile away. Their own shouts increased in volume, and hearing their voices, Bisu felt strength return to his shaking limbs. Emboldened by the approach of his own people, he began shouting insults at the snarling panther, then throwing twigs and small branches at the enraged animal. The kid added its bleats to the boy's shouts, and the birds took up the chorus. The langurs squealed and grunted, and the searchers shouted themselves hoarse, and the panther howled with rage. The forest had never before been so noisy. As the search party drew near, they could hear the panther's savage snarls, and hurried, fearing that perhaps Bisnu had been seized. Pooja began to run. Don't rush ahead, girl, said Kalam Singh. Stay between us. The panther, now aware of the approaching humans, stood still in the middle of the clearing, head thrust forward in a familiar stance. There seemed too many men for one panther. When the animal saw the light of the lantern dancing between the trees, it turned, snarled defiance and hate, and without another look at the boy in the tree, disappeared into the bushes. It was not yet ready for a showdown. Nobody turned up to claim the little goat, so Bisu kept it. A goat was a poor substitute for a dog, but, like Mary's lamb, it followed Bisu wherever he went, and the boy couldn't help being touched by its devotion. He took it down to the stream, where it would skip about in the shallows and nibble the sweet grass that grew on the banks. As for the panther, frustrated in its attempt on Bisnu's life, it did not wait long before attacking another human. It was Chitru who came running down the path one afternoon, bubbling excitedly about the panther and the postman. Chitru, deeming it safe to gather ripe bilberries in the daytime, had walked about half a mile up the path from the village when he had stumbled across Melaram's mailbag lying on the ground. Of the postman himself there was no sign, but a trail of blood led through the bushes. Once again, a party of men headed by Kalam Singh and accompanied by Bisnu and Chitru went out to look for the postman. But though they found Melaram's blood-stained clothes, they could not find his body. The panther had made no mistake this time. It was to be several weeks before Manjari had a new postman. A few days after Melaram's disappearance, an old woman was sleeping with her head near the open door of her house. She had been advised to sleep inside with the door closed, but the nights were hot, and anyway, the old woman was a little deaf, and in the middle of the night, an hour before moonrise, the panther seized her by the throat. A strangled cry woke her grown-up son, and all the men in the village woke up at his shouts and came running. The panther dragged the old woman out of the house and down the steps, but left her when the men approached with their axes and spears and made off into the bushes. The old woman was still alive, and the men made a rough stretcher of bamboo and vines and started carrying her up the path. But they had not gone far when she began to cough, and because of her terrible throat wounds, her lungs collapsed and she died. It was the dark of the month, the week of the new moon, when nights are darkest. Bisu, closing the front door and lighting the kerosene lantern, said, "I wonder where that panther is tonight." The panther was busy in another village, Saru's village. A woman and her daughter had been out in the evening bedding the cattle down in the stable. The girl had gone into the house and the woman was following. As she bent down to go in at the low door, the panther sprang from the bushes. Fortunately, one of its paws hit the doorpost and broke the force of the attack, or the woman would have been killed. When she cried out, the men came round shouting and the panther slunk off. The woman had deep scratches on her back and was badly shocked. The next day, a small party of villagers presented themselves in front of the magistrate's office at Kempty and demanded that something be done about the panther. But the magistrate was away on tour, and there was no one else in Kempty who had a gun. Mr. Naughtiel met the villagers and promised to write to a well-known shikari, but said that it would be at least a fortnight before the shikari would be able to come. Bisnu was fretting because he could not go to school. Most boys would be only too happy to miss school, but when you are living in a remote village in the mountains and having an education is the only way of seeing the world, you look forward to going to school, even if it is 5 miles from home. Bisnu's exams were only 2 weeks off, and he didn't want to remain in the same class while the others were promoted. Besides, he knew he could pass even though he had missed a number of lessons. But he had to sit for the exams. He couldn't miss them. "Cheer up, Baya," said Pooja, as they sat drinking glasses of hot tea after their evening meal. "The panther may go away once the rains break." "Even the rains are late this year," said Bisnu. "It's so hot and dry, can't we open the door?" "And be dragged down the steps by the panther?" said his mother. "It isn't safe to have the window open, let alone the door," and she went to the small window through which a cat would have found difficulty in passing, and bolted it firmly. With a sigh of resignation, Bisnu threw off all his clothes except his underwear and stretched himself out on the earthen floor. "We will be rid of the beast soon," said his mother. "I know it in my heart. Our prayers will be heard, and you shall go to school and pass your exams." To cheer up her children, she told them a humorous story which had been handed down to her by her grandmother. It was all about a tiger, a panther, and a bear, the 3 of whom were made to feel very foolish by a thief hiding in the hollow trunk of a banyan tree. Bisnu was sleepy and did not listen very attentively. He dropped off to sleep before the story was finished. When he woke, it was dark and his mother and sister were asleep on the cot. He wondered what it was that had woken him. He could hear his sister's easy breathing and the steady ticking of the clock. Far away an owl hooted, an unlucky sign, his mother would have said, but she was asleep and Bisnu was not superstitious. And then he heard something scratching at the door, and the hair on his head felt tight and prickly. It was like a cat scratching, only louder. The door creaked a little whenever it felt the impact of the paw, a heavy paw, as Bisnu could tell from the dull sound it made. "It's the panther," he muttered under his breath, sitting up on the hard floor. The door, he felt, was strong enough to resist the panther's weight, and if he set up an alarm, he could rouse the village. But the middle of the night was no time for the bravest of men to tackle a panther. In a corner of the room stood a long bamboo stick with a sharp knife tied to one end, which Bisnu sometimes used for spearing fish. Crawling on all fours across the room, he grasped the homemade spear, and then, scrambling onto a cupboard, he drew level with the skylight window. He could get his head and shoulders through the window. "What are you doing up there?" said Pooja, who had woken up at the sound of Bisnu shuffling about the room. "Be quiet," said Bisnu. "You wake mother." Their mother was awake by now. "Come down from there, Bisnu. I can hear a noise outside." "Don't worry," said Bisnu, who found himself looking down on the wriggling animal which was trying to get its paw in under the door. With his mother and Pooja awake, there was no time to lose. He had got the spear through the window, and though he could not maneuver it so as to strike the panther's head, he brought the sharp end down with considerable force on the animal's rump. With a roar of pain and rage, the man-eater leapt down from the steps and disappeared into the darkness. It did not pause to see what had struck it. Certain that no human could have come upon it in that fashion, it ran fearfully to its lair, howling until the pain subsided. A panther is an enigma. There are occasions when it proves itself to be the most cunning animal under the sun, and yet the very next day, it will walk into an obvious trap that no self-respecting jackal would ever go near. One day, a panther will prove itself to be a complete coward and run like a hare from a couple of dogs, and on the very next, it will dash in amongst half a dozen men sitting round a campfire and inflict terrible injuries on them. It is not often that a panther is taken by surprise, as its power of sight and hearing are very acute. It is a master at the art of camouflage, and its spotted coat is admirably suited for the purpose. It does not need heavy jungle to hide in. A couple of bushes and the light and shade from surrounding trees are enough to make it almost invisible. Because the Manjari panther had been fooled by Bisnu, it did not mean that it was a stupid panther. It simply meant that it had been a little careless. And Bisnu and Puja, growing in confidence since their midnight encounter with the animal, became a little careless themselves. Puja was hoeing the last field above the house, and Bisnu, at the other end of the same field, was chopping up several branches of green oak prior to leaving the wood to dry in the loft. It was late afternoon, and the descending sun glinted in patches on the small river. It was a time of day when only the most desperate and daring of man-eaters would be likely to show itself. Pausing for a moment to wipe the sweat from his brow, Bisnu glanced up at the hillside, and his eye caught sight of a rock on the brow of the hill which seemed unfamiliar to him. Just as he was about to look elsewhere, the round rock began to grow and then alter its shape, and Bisnu, watching in fascination, was at last able to make out the head and forequarters of the panther. It looked enormous from the angle at which he saw it, and for a moment he thought it was a tiger. But Bisnu knew instinctively that it was the man-eater. Slowly the wary beast pulled itself to its feet and began to walk round the side of the great rock. For a second it disappeared, and Bisnu wondered if it had gone away. Then it reappeared, and the boy was all excitement again. Very slowly and silently, the panther walked across the face of the rock until it was in direct line with the corner of the field where Puja was working. With a thrill of horror, Bisnu realized that the panther was stalking his sister. He shook himself free from the spell which had woven itself round him, and shouting hoarsely, ran forward. "Run, Puja, run!" he called. "It's on the hill above you." Puja turned to see what Bisnu was shouting about. She saw him gesticulate to the hill behind her, looked up just in time to see the panther crouching for his spring. With great presence of mind, she leapt down the banking of the field and tumbled into an irrigation ditch. The springing panther missed its prey, lost its foothold on the slippery shale banking, and somersaulted into the ditch a few feet away from Puja. Before the animal could recover from its surprise, Bisnu was dashing down the slope, swinging his axe and shouting, "Maro, Maro, kill, kill." Two men came running across the field. They too were armed with axes. Together with Bisnu they made a half-circle around the snarling animal, which turned at bay and plunged at them in order to get away. Puja wriggled along the ditch on her stomach. The men aimed their axes at the panther's head, and Bisnu had the satisfaction of getting in a well-aimed blow between the eyes. The animal then charged straight at one of the men, knocked him over, and tried to get at his throat. Just then Sanjay's father arrived with his long spear. He plunged the end of the spear into the panther's neck. The panther left its victim and ran into the bushes, dragging the spear through the grass and leaving a trail of blood on the ground. The men followed cautiously, all except the man who had been wounded and who lay on the ground, while Puja and the other womenfolk rushed up to help him. The panther had made for the bed of the stream, and Bisnu Sanjay's father and their companion were able to follow it quite easily. The water was red where the panther had crossed the stream, and the rocks were stained with blood. After they had gone downstream for about a furlong, they found the panther lying still on its side at the edge of the water. It was mortally wounded, but it continued to wave its tail like an angry cat. Then, even the tail lay still. "It is dead," said Basu. "It will not trouble us again in this body." "Let us be certain," said Sanjay's father, and he bent down and pulled the panther's tail. There was no response. "It is dead," said Kalam Singh. "No panther would suffer such an insult were it alive." They cut down a long piece of thick bamboo and tied the panther to it by its feet. Then, with their enemy hanging upside down from the bamboo pole, they started back for the village. "There will be a feast at my house tonight," said Kalam Singh. "Everyone in the village must come, and tomorrow we will visit all the villages in the valley and show them the dead panther, so that they may move about again without fear." "We can sell the skin in Kempty," said their companion. "It will fetch a good price." "But the claws we will give to Bisu," said Kalam Singh, putting his arm around the boy's shoulders. "He has done a man's work today, he deserves the claws." A panther's or tiger's claws are considered to be lucky charms. "I will take only 3 claws," said Bisu. "One each for my mother and sister, and one for myself. You may give the others to Sanjay and Chitru and the smaller children." As the sun set, a big fire was lit in the middle of the village of Manjari, and the people gathered round it, singing and laughing. Kalam Singh killed his fattest goat, and there was meat for everyone. Bisu was on his way home. He had just handed in his first paper, arithmetic, which he had found quite easy. Tomorrow it would be algebra, and when he got home he would have to practice square roots and cube roots and fractional coefficients. Mr. Naudial and the entire class had been happy that Bisnu had been able to sit for the exams. He was also a hero to them for his part in killing the panther. The story had spread through the villages with the rapidity of a forest fire, a fire which was now raging in Kempty town. When he walked past the hospital, he was whistling cheerfully. Dr. Taylor waved to him from the veranda steps. "How is Sanjay now?" she asked. "He is well," said Bisu. "And your mother and sister?" "They are well," said Bisu. "Are you going to get yourself a new dog?" "I am thinking about it," said Bisu. "At present I have a baby goat. I am teaching it to swim." He started down the path to the valley. Dark clouds had gathered, and there was a rumble of thunder. A storm was imminent. "Wait for me," shouted Saru, running down the path behind Bisu, his milk cans clanging against each other. He fell into step beside Bisu. "Well, I hope we don't have any more man-eaters for some time," he said. "I've lost a lot of money by not being able to take milk up to Kempty. We should be safe as long as a shikari doesn't wound another panther. There was an old bullet wound in the man-eater's thigh. That's why it couldn't hunt in the forest. The deer were too fast for it." "Is there a new postman yet?" "He starts tomorrow. A cousin of Melaram's." When they reached the parting of their ways, it had begun to rain a little. "I must hurry," said Saru. "It's going to get heavier any minute." "I feel like getting wet," said Bisu. "This time it's the monsoon, I'm sure." Bisu entered the forest on his own, and at the same time the rain came down in heavy opaque sheets. The trees shook in the wind, the langurs chattered with excitement. It was still pouring when Bisnu emerged from the forest, drenched to the skin. But the rain stopped suddenly, just as the village of Manjari came in view. The sun appeared through a rift in the clouds. The leaves in the grass gave out a sweet, fresh smell. Bisnu could see his mother and sister in the field transplanting the rice seedlings. The menfolk were driving the yoked oxen through the thin mud of the fields, while the children hung on to the oxen's tails, standing on the plain wooden harrows, and, with weird cries and shouts, sending the animals almost at a gallop along the narrow terraces. Bisu felt the urge to be with them, working in the fields. He ran down the path, his feet falling softly on the wet earth. Pooja saw him coming and waved to him. She met him at the edge of the field. "How did you find your paper today?" she asked. "Oh, it was easy." Bisu slipped his hand into hers and together they walked across the field. Pooja felt something smooth and hard against her fingers, and before she could see what Bisnu was doing, he had slipped a pair of bangles over her wrist. "I remembered," he said with a sense of achievement. Pooja looked at the bangles and burst out, "But they are blue, Baya, and I wanted red and gold bangles." And then, when she saw him looking crestfallen, she hurried on, "But they are very pretty, and you did remember actually, they're just as nice as the red and gold bangles. Come into the house when you are ready. I have made something special for you." "I'm coming," said Bisu, turning towards the house. "You don't know how hungry a man gets, walking 5 miles to reach home." 2. Grammar page